In the last 3 decades, a remarkable change has transformed the face of the world's most populous country. The figures are mind-boggling. Since 1980, China's gross domestic product has increased by over 3,000%, from 300 billion to over 10 trillion. This boom has been fueled by the remarkable rise of China's manufacturing sector, symbolized by the ubiquitous Made in China mark on seemingly every factory-made product. In 1988, China's global trade was valued at 200 billion. Today, it is worth over 4 trillion. This has led to a now familiar narrative. From a primarily poor and agrarian country, China is now increasingly urban, with a burgeoning middle class enabled by the Chinese Communist Party's relaxation of rules on private capital. This, we are told repeatedly, has led to more people being lifted out of poverty than ever before in the history of the world.
China is honoring former leader Deng Xiaoping for engineering the country's rapid economic growth. Chen Wei-xiao is from Deng's home province of Sichuan. He says Deng's economic reforms made life better for ordinary Chinese.
We're eating well and we have nice clothes to wear. It's a well-off society. Everything is good. I'm very happy.
Chen was a tourist in the southern city Shenzhen. The city was China's first special economic zone, which offered preferential treatment for foreign investors and exporters wanting to cash in on the country's cheap labor.
Thing that they've done over the past 3 decades is lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, and I think that's a good achievement. In the past 10 years, there's been more attempt to secure the interests of disadvantaged people and of relatively poor people in the countryside.
As compelling as this narrative is, it does not tell the whole story. While no one can deny that the country as a whole is significantly wealthier than it was 3 decades ago, the masses of poor itinerant workers remain largely impoverished, dividing their lives between long hours in sweatshop-like factories and restless nights in squalid, overcrowded company dormitories.
For the time being, China's most significant contribution to the global economy remains cheap, reliable labor. Anyone who's ever worked an assembly line can tell you about the pressure and the boredom and the fatigue.
Conditions in the factories have often been harsh. Poor safety, illegally long working hours, cramped accommodation, few breaks and little leave.
An undercover investigation into the world's largest electronics company, Samsung, by the human rights organization China Labour Watch, has revealed that abuse of workers is rife in factories either owned by Samsung or in those that make parts for Samsung products. 8 factories were investigated, including 6 directly operated by Samsung and 2 supplier plants by spies posing as workers or interviewing workers. They found forced and excessive child labour, excessive overtime, exhausting working conditions, and widespread verbal and physical abuse.
This story, the story of the brutal conditions that make the world's cheap plastic products possible, and the desperation of the workers who make them, has threatened to burst through the bubble of first-world ignorance before. In 2012, the issue of the suicide problem at electronics manufacturer Foxconn, with over 1 million employees across China and 400,000 in Shenzhen alone, became headline news when it was brought to the public's attention by Mike Daisy and his one-man show, The Agony and the Ecstasy of Steve Jobs, which detailed his experience traveling to Shenzhen with an interpreter and interviewing the company's workers.
In my first 2 hours of my first day at that gate, I met workers who were 14 years old. I met workers who were 13 years old. I met workers who were 12. Do you really think Apple doesn't know?
When Daisy's story was eventually found to contain errors and fabrications, the issue of Foxconn's treatment of its workers disappeared from the news cycle. But the reality underlying that story, a reality of long hours and poor pay and suicide nets, disappeared with it.
The suicide nets went up in the spring of 2010 when 9 Foxconn workers jumped to their deaths in the span of 3 months. A total of 18 employees took their own lives or tried to in recent years.
Some striking news. An employee of Foxconn Technology Group attempted to kill himself by cutting his veins Thursday in South China's Shenzhen City. He survived after medical treatment. While the suicide attempt came after 12 Foxconn employees had tried to end their lives, and 10 had succeeded by falling from buildings so far this year.
A tragic state of affairs, and in response, Foxconn has taken action to ensure the mental health of their employees by making them sign a pledge vowing not to kill themselves. Done and done.
While the average worker building electronics in the U.S. today makes over $23 an hour and works 41 hours a week, most of the people at Foxconn earn just over $2 an hour and strive for a 60-hour work week.
Shifts have overtime built in, so workers regularly do more than 60 hours a week, more than Apple's guidelines.
So if the workers at the bottom of China's economic miracle have seen very little of the benefits of that miracle, the question is, who has? The answer, perhaps unsurprisingly, is that a small group of families, all related to a small cadre of politicians and bureaucrats surrounding Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping during the country's transition out of Maoism in the 1970s, have reaped the lion's share of this new wealth. And they did so by cutting a deal with the corporate, financial, and banking elite of America, who were searching for a way to move the U.S. manufacturing base offshore. In order to understand this part of the story, we must first understand the history of China to know that this is not the first time the country was colonized to serve wealthy foreign interests.